I can introduce Olga whenever we're ready. Is this the right place to stand to be visible? Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Anne Lounsbury of NYU Department of Russian Slavic Studies, and I'm very, very pleased to be able to welcome our distinguished colleague from University of Michigan, Professor Olga Maiorova. A specialist in 19th century Russian literature and history, Maiorova is the author of some 60 scholarly articles in English and Russian, as well as the book From the Shadow of Empire, Defining the Russian Nation Through Cultural Mythology, 1855 to 1870. Maiorova's work is distinguished by its power to speak to topics and ideas that are of urgent interest to both Anglophone and Russophone scholars, a feat that is, as I have learned gradually, much harder to pull off than one might imagine. Her areas of particular expertise include Russian Empire, representations of Central Asia, intersections of literature, intellectual history, and nationality. She's also conducted extensive research on Nikolay Leskov, including editing 2 volumes of his previously unpublished writings. Professor Maiorova's talk today is entitled Caught in the Imperial Trap, Nikolay Leskov's The Enchanted Wanderer and Russia's Colonial Ambitions. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak here today. Thank you, and Professor Lounsbury, for the wonderful introduction, very kind words. And thank you, and I'm grateful to the Jordan Center for the possibility to come and to share my research. So, in early 1873, Nikolay Leskov, new slide, please, a prolific writer and adept storyteller, brought to completion what today is considered his masterpiece, a tangled tale about a peasant roaming across the Russian Empire. Called The Enchanted Wanderer, it is a consummate example of skaz, a verbal form that creates an illusion of markedly oral narration, featuring the unmediated monologue of a single character, usually a character of lower classes. Cultivated in Russia in the 19th century, skaz most often gives voice to a simple-minded, uneducated, but eloquent storyteller, as I said, a person of the lower classes. In The Enchanted Wanderer, this role is filled by the peasant Ivan Flyagin, the protagonist and principal narrator, who tells the whole story of his peripatetic life to his chance companions. His subjectivity and his distinct linguistic universe, full of peculiar verbal constructions, constitute the novella's subject matter no less than the events he relates. Leskov prompts readers to marvel at the colorful language, but ultimately, the verbal texture of the story is designed to reveal a profound epistemological split between the folk and educated society. Flagin's narration is calculated to surprise and even shock. Ultimately, it probes and often undermines conventional thinking. In the term famously coined by Shklovsky, Leskov's skaz defamiliarizes the world that it narrates. Above all, I would argue, The Enchanted Wanderer defamiliarizes the Russian Empire. The tale engages with a wide range of topical issues of the day and sheds new light on them. But I think its most interesting thematic aspect, and one that has gone almost unnoticed by critics, is Leskov's effort to shift readers' perspective on the Russian Empire and its colonial pursuit. Written amidst the conquest of Central Asia, The Enchanted Wanderer, I posit, addresses the questions that haunted Russian society as the war unfolded, though it does so in an indirect way. Like any skaz, the tale is characterized by an unreachable intellectual distance between the perspective of the speaking character and that of the author, who, of course, ultimately controls the entire narrative. It is through the interplay between these two perspectives that a picture of the Russian Empire emerges. While Flagen tells of his ordeals and most extensively about his life in captivity among the Asiatic Muslim nomads, the author, as I will try to show, relates these episodes to the debates about Russian imperial policies and the conquest of Central Asia. After all, one of the major pretexts for this colonial war was the humanitarian mission of ending the slave trade and freeing the prisoners languishing in Asian captivity. Leskov seems to mock this justification of the war as the tale emphatically portrays the indifference of the Russian authorities to Flagen's fate. Moreover, the Enchanted Wanderer reverses the logic of official propaganda. For Leskov, the suffering of Russian captives does not justify the conquest of new lands. On the contrary, Asian captivity is the natural outcome of the empire's colonial adventures. In short, this tale can be read as an invitation to see the acquisition of the new colony as a trap for the Russian people. As we all know, Russian literature was deeply implicated in the colonial venture, and it is important not to lose sight of its imperialist propensity and biases. Obviously, today, this task has taken on a new urgency. But it is equally important to see how, when, and why some writers began to question Russian imperial policies. As this paper seeks to show, reading The Enchanted Wanderer in the context of Russian imperialism makes it possible to capture a moment when Russian literature began to confront it. And now to the story. First, I will discuss the imperial dimension, and then I will contextualize my findings within the public discourse about the conquest of Central Asia. Ivan Flagen tells of his lifelong wanderings to chance companions aboard a steamship. As the vessel sails, Flagen's tale unfolds, and this double movement, the parallel progress over the water and through the protagonist's biography, enacts the biblical metaphor of life as a passage through worldly seas. Leskov makes this metaphor explicit when, in the concluding portion of the tale, the next slide please, he intimates our wondrous story had sailed to his life's final haven. These remarks call attention to the allegorical overtones of the story. As many critics have observed, Flagen's recitation of his ordeals can be read as a saga about the struggle of the Russian people, or, in the words of one scholar, as a parable of Russian national identity. Leskov's Flagen undergoes so many trials and is so often forced to change his name, occupation, location, and social identity that he, in effect, lives many different lives and comes to represent the entire nation. It was a trademark feature of the 1870s, the time The Enchanted Wanderer appeared, to employ the chronotype of wandering to ask profound questions about Russia or create a portrayal of national life. Next slide, please. Nekrasov's narrative poem, Who Lives Well in Russia, is organized around the roving of 7 peasants who go in search of the fortunate, but find only a suffering and depleted people. As the poem spirals outward, it opens into epic canvas of Russian life. In Dostoevsky's The Adolescent, the wanderer Makar Dolgorukiy suddenly pops up in the middle of the novel as a counterweight to St. Petersburg culture and representative of true Russianness. The renowned lay ethnographer Sergei Maximov published his Wandering Russia for the Sake of Christ, Бродячая Русь Христа ради, to wide acclaim and public debates that posited the wanderer or strannik as quintessentially Russian. And further illustrating the public fascination with this figure of strannik is the success of Vasily Perov's paintings, The Wanderer, one in 1869, another in 1870, perhaps the most iconic artistic treatment of this subject. Leskov's tale resonates with each of these works in numerous ways, especially in treating the strannik as a symbol of the nation. But it sharply diverges from all of them in geographic scope. While all these writers confine the world their wanderers traverse to Russia's native heartland, Leskov's tale repeatedly whisks Flyagin from Russia proper to the farthest reaches of the empire and back again. The story presents the space so graphically that an attentive reader can easily plot a mental map of Flagin's travels across the empire. Next slide, please. Here are approximate indications of the places where the story is set. Born a Serb, he grows up in Russia's heartland in the Oriental region. As a young man, however, he runs away from his native village and finds his first haven in Mykolaiv, a Black Sea port in the Imperial hinterland, today's Ukraine. Then the plot takes an abrupt turn and Flyagin flees again, this time ending up near the town of Penza in central Russia. There he comes across a tribe of Muslim nomads whom he calls Tatars. As we will see, they are not really Tatars, but Kazakhs, and unintentionally kills one of them. To escape Russian authorities, Flyagin ventures with the nomads into the Ryn-Peski, next slide please, in official parlance, Naryn-Peski, the Naryn sand dunes, a remote steppe that spreads along the lower reaches of the Volga and Ural rivers, extending to the shores of the Caspian Sea. Next slide, please. It's the map again. Flyagin finds himself imprisoned there and forced to spend 10 long years in captivity. Finally, able to extricate himself, he runs to Astrakhan, a city on the Caspian Sea, before returning to his native village. Later, another twist of the plot takes place, and it takes him to the northern Caucasus. After 15 years in that corner of the empire, he becomes a novice in a monastery, and the abbot sends him on a pilgrimage. On his way to Solovetsky Monastery in the far northern part of Russia, he crosses Lake Ladoga on a steamship, and there tells his life story to the random travelers. Throughout the tale, Flyagin interacts with people of different cultures, customs, and languages. Apart from Muslim nomads, the largest group of non-Russians in the tale, he comes across Poles, Jews, Chuvash, Roma, and Caucasian Highlanders. Flyagin builds all types of relationship with non-Russians. He engages in interethnic confrontations of all sorts, but he also admires their strengths, shares their passions, falls in love with a Roma girl, and in the nomad steppe even goes native. Yet whatever happens and whomever he encounters, the theme of violence dominates. The entire story is a chain of events shot through with cruelty, murder, suicide, and the search for death as a release from life, as a final release. Flagon takes cruelty for granted, just a normal part of life, whether he is suffering from it or he is inflicting it on others. In some scenes, Flagon exercises power over the subjugated nationalities, while in the majority of the scenes, non-Russians exercise power over him. In short, this tale depicts the empire as a highly complicated, heterogeneous, and certainly unequal, but heterogeneous world where power relations are certainly unequal, but multidirectional. And it is not always Russians who held sway over others. The Enchanted Wanderer can be read as a testimony of a Russian peasant who, roaming across the Russian Empire, finds himself insulted, abused, and out of place in almost all its corners. If Flagon indeed stands for the Russian people, then he represents not imperial might and glory, but a people who are unprotected, vulnerable, and lost within the empire that bears their name. In this, Leskov embarks on a critique of the empire from a national standpoint. The story of Flagon's captivity among the Muslim nomads is the clearest expression of this critique. In constructing it, Leskov plays with the figure of Ilya Muromets, the paradigmatic hero of Былины, Russian folk epic. And it makes sense, next slide, please. And it makes sense to keep in mind that the 19th century was the century when most of these Былines were collected and published for the first time. In the opening chapter of the tale, the author calls Flagon a typical Russian bogatyr and compares him to Ilya Muromets. Indeed, Flagon's boldness and brevity, the magnitude of the trials that befall him, his physical might, all come together to suggest a character of epic proportions. Especially relevant in this context and typical for bogatyr, next slide please, his willingness, as he utters at the end of the story, to die for his people. Most Russian critics tend to take this parallel with Ilya Muromets as at face value and glorify Flagon as a symbol of Russian greatness, an interpretation that became solidified in late Soviet times with the growth of Russian nationalist attitudes within the Soviet Union and still prevails, unsurprisingly, in Putin's Russia. But the comparison with Ilya Muromets is sly, ironic, and playful. It has escaped critics' scrutiny that Leskov likens Flagon not directly to the Ilya Muromets of epic, but to his representations in Russian culture, and particularly in Alexei Tolstoy's ballad Ilya Muromets. A comparison of Ivan Flagon with Tolstoy's Ilya Muromets yields a starting contrast. Tolstoy depicts the legendary hero in the moment of his decisive break with Prince Vladimir, the royal figure whom all bogatyrs serve. Tolstoy's Ilya, his honor wounded by Vladimir's disrespect, quits the royal house in protest and sets off to seek the wild freedom, it's citation. It is, if not quite rebellion, then certainly an assertion of free will and individual dignity. Leskov's protagonist, by contrast, not only acknowledges a social hierarchy and subordination, but willingly submits to his superiors. Even though Flagon spends most of the tale roaming, which would seem to imply some longing for freedom on his part, he is essentially dragged from place to place, quite contrary to his own intentions. In most cases, It is either the pressure of circumstances or someone else's decisions that caused him to flee. The sense of freedom and personal agency that drives Tolstoy's Ilya Muromets thus holds no appeal for Flyagin, nor does the notion of heroism apply to Leskov's character. The entire story is about his suffering, humiliation, and displacement. In other words, the comparison the tale proposes between Flyagin and the Bogatyr of Tolstoy's poem, is thoroughly ironic, and the epic aura evoked in Leskov's story points to the Russian people's insecurity rather than greatness. When Flyagin recounts how he came to be taken prisoner, he begins by introducing the Tatar nomads, his soon-to-be captors, whom he encounters near the town of Penza. The nomads amaze him with their outlandish customs and magnificent horses. Throughout the story, Flyagin calls these people Tatars. But any educated reader of the time could easily figure out, and indeed they figure out, and indeed did figure out, as we know from contemporary responses to the tale, that the Tatar nomads featured in the tale had nothing to do with the real Tatars, who by that time had been a settled population for centuries. The story actually portrays Kazakhs, a relatively small group from the Kazakh junior horde who became Russian subjects in the 18th century. A little later, in the beginning of the 19th century, the Russian government resettled this group from the east bank of the Ural River, their traditional lands, to the west bank of the river, a territory that had been controlled by Russians for centuries. The government called this group the inner horde to emphasize its location within the European part of the Tsarist Empire, in contrast to the rest of the Kazakh tribes who inhabited the land beyond the Ural River. Leskov's tale clearly identifies the inner horde's location, the Rim-Pisky, spreading along the lower reaches of the Volga and the Ural rivers. To mark the place unmistakably for his immediate readership, Leskov has Flyagin use an almost precise name for the leader of the horde, Khan Janga, in reality Khan Jangi. The author thus unambiguously signals the true ethnic origins of the nomads featured in the story. Yet they always figure in Flyagin's story as Tatars, and this makes it possible for him to see his encounter with them through the prism of Bulin. Russian oral epic features Tatars, the Mongol Tatars, and other Turkic-speaking peoples of the Eurasian steppe as the principal antagonists with whom a Bogatyr enters into single combat to defend the people of Rus. Like Ilya Muromets, Leskov protagonists fights with a Tatar, and following the epic pattern, of course, defeats and kills him. Moreover, Flyagin understands that combat as an epic clash between the two peoples, typical motivation for a fight in Bulin. Next slide, please. He explains that he killed the Tatar unwillingly because the man refused to give up. He was considered the foremost battler in the whole Rim sands and didn't want to yield to me for anything. He wanted to endure nobly so that shame wouldn't fall on his Asiatic nation on account of him. But the aftermath of the contest completely breaks the epic mode. Having murdered the Tatar, Flyagin is faced with a dilemma: either go to jail or escape along with the courts. Pursued by Russians, the new Ilya Muromets chooses to venture into the Rim-Pisky. But upon arrival, Flyagin realizes that he is essentially a captive. Thus, Leskov concocts a very interesting story about the victor taken prisoner by the vanquished. Moreover, Flyagin is held captive by subjects of the Russian Empire and lives as a prisoner of the ethnic other on Russian territory. To dispel any possible confusion regarding the political loyalty of Flagin's captors, Leskov emphatically underscores that the nomads are Russian subjects. One of the Flagin's companions at the peasant fair, a local Russian well acquainted with the life of the court, calls Khan Jangar the Tsar of the Ring-Peski. Next slide, please. But isn't that step ours, asks Flyagin in amazement, and his question is swiftly answered in the affirmative. Yes, it's ours, but we can't have any hold on it. The Enchanted Wanderer employs the extraordinary popular motive of the prisoner held captive by Asiatics, a staple of the literature of Imperialism, and a plot line common to folklore, old Russian literature, popular print, Lubok, and of course canonical works of the 19th century Russians, like Prisoner of the Caucasus by Pushkin and Tolstoy, and it's only the tip of that iceberg. In this long chain of literary precedents, all captives are held prisoner in foreign lands or lands not fully controlled by Russians. Flyagin, on the contrary, endures his captivity on Russian soil, well inside the Russian Empire. Leskov clearly distinguishes between Russia proper, what Flyagin calls his homeland, and the imperial periphery, and presents the empire as a threat to its Russian core. In imperial space, the Russian Bagatit is lost, unprotected, even imprisoned by the other. This vividly presents the Russian people caught in the imperial trap. Leskov's captivity narrative repeatedly sounds the theme of Russians' insecure position in the empire. When two Orthodox missionaries visit the nomads holding Flyagin captive, he asks them, the missionaries, to ransom him. But the missionaries refuse, explaining that attempts to rescue him might endanger, I quote, the wide Tsar's relations with the Asiatics. Next slide, please. They explained, we are not permitted to threaten the infidels because they are devious and disloyal people, even without that. And we maintain a cautious policy towards them. This dialogue resonates with the Russians' reaction to Flagin's duel with the Tatar. Defending himself from his countrymen's, from Russians' accusations, Flyagin makes what seemed to him an irrefutable point. Next slide, please. It was all done amicably. Would it have been better if he beat me to death? But in response, Flyagin is told, he could beat you to death, and it would be nothing to him because he is of another faith. But you are to be judged as a Christian. Come along, let's go to the police. These two episodes capture a characteristic feature of Russia as an empire of difference. The various ethnic groups were subordinated to the supreme power, to the Tsar, on different terms. And imperial policy allowed many of them, though not all, to retain their distinct social structures, religious identities, and some local political and judicial institutions. Russia granted privileges to some groups that others never received, and left some of its subjects to a considerable degree outside the jurisdiction of Russian imperial authorities, all in the name of winning the loyalty of the colonized. The Enchanted Wanderer alludes to this system of government, but of course it doesn't give an accurate account of it. Leskov offers instead a grotesque rendition of Russia as an empire where some groups, Russian peasants included, enjoyed fewer privileges and judged by different laws than other groups. What we are dealing with is an artistic version of subversive nationalist discourse that challenges the empire by portraying the politics of empire from national standpoint. Leskov's Russian peasant, held captive on Russian soil by Asiatic subjects of the Tsar, is a symbolic incarnation of insecurity of the Russian folk. And of course, it is a mordant satire of imperial policy. The satire becomes all the more bitter when we remember that at this very time, the empire was waging war on Central Asia in the name of freeing Russian prisoners. Historians, by the way, showed that it was really a pretext, and during the conquest, the Russian army didn't care about the prisoners in Central Asia. But does the story have a more direct and unmediated connection to Russia's expansion into Central Asia? The frustration with Russian imperial policies that the Enchanted Wanderer encapsulates pervaded the public discourse of the 19th century and escalated as the conquest of Central Asia unfolded. Leskov's story, in a way, captures the anxieties and concerns that the war provoked. In the mid-19th century, with the loss of the Crimean War, Russia became intent on acquiring Central Asian territory, driven by strategic considerations, but also a desire to restore its military and geographical prestige. The empire advanced swiftly and spectacularly. The sudden appearance of a new and steadily growing colony called Turkestan on the map of the empire initially struck a chord with Russian society. Periodicals across the political spectrum greeted it enthusiastically as Russia's providential mission to bring progress to the savages and save humanity from the menace emanating from the barbarous tribes of Central Asia. As the campaign unfolded, however, anxious interrogations of the aims and limits began to circulate in the public discourse, and the debate grew more and more heated as worries of imperial overreach mounted. Russia's outsized ambitions prompted questions about the enormous burden, both military and financial, being placed on the state and on the Russian people. In a more nationalistic mode, the press expressed concerns about how and if the advance into Central Asia served the interests of the Russian nation. More than once, noted Mikhail Katkov, the editor of the newspaper Moskovsky Vedomosti, the press remarked upon the danger that the conquest of Khiva Khanate, it's exactly the conquest that was discussed at the time Leskov was writing his tale, that the conquest of the Khiva Khanate might make of it a second Caucasus. Katkov found in tsarist rule of the Caucasus a long chain of errors: toleration of Islam, privileges granted to indigenous elites, preservation of local institutions, all of which he claimed hindered Russian moral, cultural, and political hegemony in the region. Would Russia repeat the same mistakes in Turkestan? Was Turkestan to be integrated into the empire according to the old principles of toleration of difference practiced in the Caucasus? Or would the empire be ruled on behalf or for the benefit of the ethnically Russian people who were to dominate it politically and culturally? Such dilemmas of imperial rule were not new, but as the conquest of Central Asia unfolded, the critique of imperial policies from a national standpoint assumed new urgency. Leskov was well aware of the era of polemics about nation and empire, and up to a certain point, he even gravitated towards Katkov's view in this regard. The Enchanted Wanderer is surely informed by the concerns that circulated in the press. But this tale went much further than simply capturing the anxieties of the time. The story, I think, generates an image of a Russian empire that has already integrated Central Asia within its borders. What supports my point is the way the tale portrays the inner horde. Regardless of its precise toponyms, the recognizable name of the Khan, and the accurate description of the landscape, Flagin's captivity narrative is obviously and intentionally misplaced. Let me explain. The Enchanted Wanderer reproduces the entire repertoire of Orientalist tropes to portray the nomads as savage, treacherous, incredibly cruel, and violent. Over the course of his captivity, Flagin is dominated, manipulated, even stolen when one tribe kidnaps him from another. His body is mutilated. Not only does he suffer himself, he watches others, Orthodox and Jewish missionaries, tortured and brutally murdered. There is nothing unusual here, except, nothing unusual in kind of when compared to European Orientalism. There is normal, typical, except for the tale's tendency to pair Orientalization of its Kazakhs with Russian self-Orientalization. While Flagin presents the nomads as Russia's timeless other and sees himself as unquestionably distinct from them, the tale as a whole accentuates their similarities. This is in the nature of skaz, where the perspectives of the author clashes with the character's perspective. As I already mentioned, throughout the tale, Leskov emphasizes Flagin's cruelty and portrays the whole Russian world as violent. In terms of Russians' propensity for violence, the divide between Russian self and Asian other appears elusive. But perhaps the most important aspect of Flagin's captivity narrative is that it is flat out unbelievable. Checked against 19th century accounts of the inner horde, Flagin's story emerges as unvarnished Oriental fantasy. While he characterizes the Narin steppe as the dangerous and impenetrable frontier zone, home only to wild beasts, hardy livestock, and fierce Asiatics, Russian accounts of the inner horde published at the same time reveal a completely different picture, with the Kazakh engaged in education, elementary and beyond, quickly adapting to a half-sedentary lifestyle and engaging in productive trade networks with other parts of the empire. Perhaps the most striking example of the distorted representation of the horde in Flagin's skaz is the portrayal of Khan Jahangir, its ruler. While in The Enchanted Wanderer, he is a cruel savage, the real Khan Jahangir petitioned the Russian government to admit Kazakhs to institutions of higher education, hired English and French tutors, this is my favorite, for his own children, and amassed a rich private library that included an impressive collection of Russian books and periodicals. In the mid-19th century, the integration of the inner horde into the empire was well underway, and imperial authorities exercised increasing control throughout the territory. In this context, the story of a Russian captive completely abandoned by his compatriots seems quite improbable, and Leskov's contemporary could hardly take it at face value. In the press of the 60s, the inner court figured as a living proof of the success of the Russian colonial projects and civilizing mission. Periodicals across the ideological spectrum, including the most influential literary journals, regularly published reports about how the life of the inner court had been transformed. Lagin's Oriental fantasy goes against these representations of the inner court, but it dovetails perfectly with the rhetoric about the Central Asian Khanates, especially Khiva, rhetoric that was circulating widely in Russia at that time. In other words, the steppe portrayed in Leskov's story is diverse from its real referent and stands instead for Central Asian lands. If we recognize that the object of Leskov's critique is imperial policies that leave Russians unprotected in their own empire, then the Enchanted Wanderer can be read as a warning that with such imperial policies, a new conquest is contrary to the interests of the Russian people, and that Asian captivity would be the natural outcome of Russia's colonial adventure. The Enchanted Wanderer marks a turning point in Leskov's intellectual trajectory. It's the first work that questions the politics of empire, and it encapsulates, sometimes in grotesque form, a pervasive critical unease over the standing of the Russian people in the rapidly expanding empire. Over the two subsequent decades, Leskov's critique of the empire from a national standpoint, a kind of subversive nationalist discourse, as I said, was to develop into a critique of Russia from the perspective of the colonized. He would denounce the abuse and discrimination of subjugated nationalities, Jews, Poles, Baltic Germans, and people from the northern Siberia. He would speak in their defense and rebuke Alexander III's Russification policies. This paper began with the question of how and why some Russian writers began to express their discontent with the imperial order. Leskov's case shows both the rationale for and the mechanism by which anti-imperialist attitudes arose. Initially, a critique of the empire from the standpoint of his own nation, Leskov's views developed into a critique on behalf of the subjugated nationalities of the Russian Empire. This is, of course, a theme for a separate paper about these 2 decades, but Leskov's intellectual trajectory wasn't unique. It's pretty much applicable to many other Russian writers. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga, for that incredibly rich talk. I think we have a lot to talk about. So floor is open to questions. And Lana, I think you'll keep track of the Zoom questions. Jillian.
Hi, I'm Jillian Porter. I work here. Thank you so much for this presentation. It was great. So I'm interested in the function of skaz here in light of the fact that it sounds like Leskov is suggesting that Russian imperialism was being conducted at the expense of the Russian nation, and he has this figure of the peasant who is narrating in skaz form. Given that skaz often has a comedic element where it's, you know, the elite readers are almost invited to laugh at or are explicitly invited to laugh at the narrator, is this critique of Russian imperialism happening at the expense of the peasantry or not? I mean, I guess I'm just interested in this question of how is the skaz functioning? There was a passage, it was the quotation that was about the battle between the 2 men, and the statement was that, you know, because the one figure was known as the best fighter, he didn't want to give up their reputation. And in the Russian, there was this phrasing, через эту амбицию, or something, which seemed like a very odd phrasing with that word ambitia. And I noticed it wasn't in the translation. And I just wondered, is that a movement of skaz with a play on that word, which is, you know, a word associated with nobility and class? And is that a moment that we could focus in on to talk about how skaz is functioning in relation to this question of how is Leskov using the peasantry to launch his critique of imperialism as being at the expense of the peasantry?
It's a great question. Thank you very much. I think that it's a multi-layered narrative. And on some levels, we are supposed to laugh. And there are lots of comical scenes. And it's the things that defamiliarize the narrative, that defamiliarizes the world around us, very often is funny and satirical. But at the same time, we need to keep it to remember the focus of that time, to give a voice to the lower classes, to understand the world from their perspective. And it was Leskov's lifelong commitment. So it's both. It's the way to reveal the subjectivity of this character, to laugh, but also to be compassionate. But so it's a very it's a very complex narrative. So, and you know, it's interesting that Western scholars very often read the story as comical. Russian scholars, Russian critics tend to read it as a glorification of Russia's mind. You see, so completely different interpretations. And of course, in the case of Russia, it's ideologically loaded. So, and I don't think that one reading, I'm not talking about whether it is kind of elevates Russia or not. I'm talking about your question. Is it comical? And we are supposed to see that the writer is kind of playing with this narrative. It is playful, definitely. But at the same time, it is a serious concern about the Russian people and the Russian Empire. So I would see that these two things are, we cannot separate them from each other. Does it make sense?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Can I just piggyback on Jillian for a minute? So what about the word ambitia? Is that a word that someone like Lyagin would actually know and use, or is that a Leskov intervention?
It's a great question as well. I would say that we need to see how it was written. Ambitia with U, which is not literal, which is not educated people would do. And I'm glad that modern publications, they keep this wrong orthography. And this is an answer to your question. It's actually Lyagin who says that, because an educated person, the author himself, wouldn't, and it's not used correctly, to say the least. It's a very weird use of this word, which means, and I mentioned at the beginning, that Lyagin changes his social identities throughout the story. He learned from others. He might be illiteral. It's not completely clear whether or not he can read, write, but he is exposed to very wide and diverse social strata. So he picked up this. It's also comical.
My sense, correct me if I'm wrong, just on the ambitsia thing, it's a language of the Dvarovы.
Yeah.
Right.
And he is Dvarovy.
And he is Dvarovy, exactly. So it's so it makes total sense for him to use it. It's not it's not surprising. And it doesn't mean ambition, it means pride or overweening sort of.
That's why I did not I didn't actually use translations, existing translations for the citations, but this is the only one that I changed, because It's not ambition, it's something else.
Irina, and then yeah.
This fight is also a parodical duel.
Right.
And there's the word благородное, right? And the word ambiция actually was used in that discourse as well. In if you look at the Dawes dictionary, ambiция could be, well, it was part of the kind of the concept of honor discourse. For instance, there was an expression, я сегодня не при амбиции, I'm without my what is sword? Yeah. Sword, yeah. So this is obviously like a parody to it. And the initial agreement is that they will not suffer, none of them, as you know, duelists did, but not as real criminals and so on. And then that also changes. And this is not only the only time when Plagin is involved in this type of kind of
contest.
Not the contest, but the discussion of dueling. Leskov was interested in that topic. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was really, really interesting. And I have a few. I'll just ask one question for now.
Just a second, we are recording the questions, right? I don't need to write down them now. Sure, I will be able to look at them later.
So I was curious about in the context in which you're presenting the story. I was curious about Plagin's special relationship with horses, and in particular his miraculous or nearly miraculous capacity to tame them, right? And I was wondering whether or not the imperial horseman topos or motif and the idea that the horse is a quality or a kind of nation or the state that is then mastered or controlled or taken charge of can be read woven into this account as a kind of another sort of partly satirical, partly serious dimension of what is taking place.
It's a very good question. Thank you so much, Ilya. I thought about this motif in connection with Plagin's efforts to build a divide between himself and the Tatars, because they have magnificent horses, and he is interested in the horses, but he always emphasizes how differently he treats the horses rather than. But we see that they share this fascination with the horses. So I see this as the effort to of a Russian writer to self-orientalize Russians, but or at least to challenge the belief in the divide in the impenetrable divide between them. But you might be right. It's a very interesting idea. It didn't occur to me that it might be connected with the imperial motif of horsemen. Thank you.
Graham and then Russell.
Yes, thank you so much for that presentation. It was super interesting. You were talking about the aspect of like the travel narrative and showing us the map. It just made me keep thinking about the initial frame narrative of the story, specifically when they're at the ancient Russian settlement and they get back on the boat and they start talking about how intolerably boring it is. And just the way that even when they've sent exiles there, the exiles can't stay for long before they have to leave and go to the far reaches of the empire. And so I was interested about the way that this place that's coded as ancient Russia is specifically coded as intolerably boring, and the way that motivates both the narrative but also the Russian imperial project. And I'm just wondering how that fits into your reading here, or how that figures into Leskov's critique.
Right. Thank you very much. It's a great question. It's Anne's domain about the provincial life as being terribly boring. Right. I'm not sure I know how it fits into the critique of the empire, but I think it's the way to engage with a very popular motif. that provincial life is boring. And actually, they begin to talk about that when they just leave St. Petersburg. They are on the Lake Ladoga when they talk about the provincial life, but it's right next to the capital, right? So it's a kind of Leskov's way to play with the different meanings of the war of the locale where stories take place. But it's also interesting that all non-Russian locales, they are much more interesting in the story than the Russian ones. The story very quickly narrates how Plagin spent time in St. Petersburg. I even didn't mention it, didn't put it on the map. Very little about him living in Central Asia and moving from one marketplace to another marketplace. No descriptions of the landscape of life there, but detailed description of the nomads. So kind of Russian life is boring, but the life on the periphery is interesting but dangerous.
Yeah, or at least these Russian settings are not generating narrative in the same way.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
You have to get out towards some sort of a quote periphery. Yeah, that's really interesting. Awesome.
Sorry, this is really coming from the depths of my own ignorance, as a 20th century scholar, because we know how the Caucasus is this incredibly important space for Russian literature,
right.
In a way that 19th century Russian literature really doesn't pay much attention to Central Asia. I mean, at least the first year writers, and I was wondering about if you could speak about other texts of classical 19th century Russian literature, at least partly set or concerning Central Asia, because I know of a much larger body about which Alexander Morrison has written about texts produced by Poruchik and all these adventure novels or travelogues, but any texts of literary significance set in.
There were plenty of texts, but not the first-rate writers were involved, because the first-rate writers traveled to the Caucasus, and most of them never traveled to Central Asia. But my vision of that, first of all, there were some very visible writers like Nikolay Karazin, who traveled to, but Nikolay Karazin was also a painter, and Vasily Vereshchagin, another famous painter who portrayed Central Asia and the conquest, is very famous as a painter, but he was also a writer, a very good writer. So his travelogues, his works are important. But my main point about Central Asia, as I'm studying how this imperial borderland, how this colony was portrayed by Russia, is not a direct, that the Russian writers were not involved in a direct portrayal of the region, but the conquest of the region affected them deeply and changed their vision of the empire. And Leskov is only one writer like that. Actually, I think Tolstoy's intellectual trajectory was also affected by the conquest of Central Asia. In 1872, right before Leskov published The Enchanted Wanderer, Tolstoy published The Prisoner of the Caucasus with his own critique of his Kafkaski Plennik, with his own critique of, not that explicit, but palpable critique of the Russian Empire. Why in 1872? It had been like more than 10 years since Tolstoy wrote a lot about, had written a lot about his experience in the Caucasus. I think it was the narratives about freeing the slaves in Central Asia and the captivity narratives that were published all the time in the journals at that time, that gave him an idea to think about that. And his critique of the empire began to develop exactly in the 1870s. So it's not the direct portrayal of the region, but what I'm trying to do in my larger project is to show how Russian writers were confused, just like the intelligence as a whole, were confused with this conquest, concerned about that, and how they portrayed it indirectly.
We have a question. Can you read it, Mom?
Yeah, I think it's question does Leskov also use I'm not sure it's Kaiser in the sense of someone knowledgeable about horses?
Right. And it's again the word that is kind of not normal. It's not a part of literary language. It's Leskov kind of creates very peculiar verbal words and verbal constructs that it's like ambitia. It's wrong.
Because it's from corn. It's like horse.
Yes.
Right. So he's
yes,
doing French connoisseur with horse.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or he gives new etymology, creates new etymology to this word. It's Leskov's favorite play. Or game. That's what he always did.
That was Ingrid Cleeseby's, by the way.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Ingrid. Thank
Yeah.
you, Ingrid, for your question.
This one is also about the word and about the quotation that appeared on the presentation, and specifically this curious phrase "Asiatskую nacию." And I was curious, it made me curious. I mean, obviously also kind of strange misuse, and in general, the whole kind of question of naция, народ, and so on, народности, и народцы. And I was curious if you've traced through the story, you've traced the uses of these terms, and if there's some predominate or some combinations predominate, just kind of to sort of see where the story fits in the conceptual history of this term with which you are so familiar.
It's interesting because I think the word Nazi was not widespread in the second half of the 19th century. Usually narod, meaning nationality, meaning the nation, but it's again, it was at that time relatively new word. In the 19th century, it was clearly a borrowing from the Western discourses, and it's again, Flagen uses it incorrectly. Or what is one Asiatic nation? But of course, it's a typical Orientalist discourse to mix all the different nationalities into one. It's very Orientalist attitude.
Could I ask about Ilya Muromets? And of course, he mentions Ilya Muromets that we, have to take it, right? But at the same time, Ilya Muromets is not very much like Flagen, but Vasily Buslaev is. Yeah, like Ilya Muromets, after all, spends his childhood sleeping, right? And Vasily Buslaev, another big character, right, started committing violence like in his, I don't know, cradle. What do you think about it? Was he kind of directing the attention to the wrong epic era?
As I tried to show, it's ironic. The parallel with Ilya Muromets is completely ironic. Leskov was very skeptical about this grandiose representation of the Russian nation at that time, even though he was, until a certain point, pretty close to Katkov, and you would expect that he would be a kind of imperial nationalist. No, he was not. And after the Enchanted Wanderer, their relationships deteriorated, and actually the Enchanted Wanderer was written for Katkov, but Katkov refused publication. He was shocked by this story. I think it's completely satirical and ironic, all the parallels with Ilya.
But did he want us to recall Vasily Buslaev?
That's what I don't know.
No, of course we
I
can,
need to
but
see to what extent Vasily Buslaev was discussed and kind of at that time, at the second half of the 19th century.
well,
Ilya Muromets was a hero of that time. I mean, if you open almost every thick literary journal of that time, it would be articles, papers about Ilya Muromets. I don't remember anything about Vasily Buslaev, but it's a great question.
Yeah, it was published at that time, so it had to be known.
Yeah, probably, but not that widely discussed. But I need to double check. It's a good question.
And I think the association was specifically between Russians and Ilya Muromets, specifically Ilya Muromets, not other Berlin heroes, right? But Ilya Muromets, who became by 1972 such an incredible cliche that he could not have possibly used it seriously.
Right.
Just like...
And that's what is awful, because children in Russia, in schools, they are still taught that this story is glorification of the Russian nation. And look, even the simple, iconic image of Russianness is central to this story.
I actually have a follow-up question then about reception, contemporary reception in East Coast time, and I don't know how much we know about it, but to what degree did people kind of get the joke? How clear was it to readers that, for example, his representation of the inner horde was very skewed? Was this commented on?
This is the most difficult aspect of my research, because actually this story was published in a very obscure newspaper. After Katkov refused publication, Leskov published it in Ruski Mir, which didn't have wide circulation. And initially, the story went almost unnoticed. But over the time, by the end of the 19th century, it became really seriously discussed, but unfortunately in a very nationalist terms. So, and only in the 20th century, people began to understand the jokes, to see it as a satirical narrative. But I'm still checking and reading and looking for the responses, because there were not that many, especially during the first 10 years after the publication.
It's really striking, because the other thing to me that it just kind of shocks me over and over again when I read the story is the extreme violence. So it seems like there would have been responses at least to the violence, right? I mean, one of the first things he does is kill a kitten for fun, and then he moves through the rest of his life.
And then kills a monk for fun.
Yeah.
For fun.
Yeah, and so, it, to me, like, that colors everything when I read the story, but maybe that did not have the same effect on readers in the 1870s.
I'm afraid you're right. They were so accustomed to the violent world that they didn't emphasize that.
No.
Can I ask a follow-up to what you said about the beginning of the 19th century and the renewed interest in the story? I was curious. This
of the 20th century.
Sorry, 20th century. I was curious because right towards the end, there's an invocation of a coming war, right?
Right. Exactly.
In which was it at all linked to World War I, understanding of World War I at the time as a
That's a good question, but I don't know.
Yeah.
If anybody saw or kind of, you mean at the time of World
So
War
two
I?
questions. One would be what is the war that Leskov is thinking about? And two is the reception of it in the early 20th century, whether the World War I or Russo-Japanese War or whatever else, right? Because there's almost the kind of, towards the end, there's this prophetic moment. And this prophetic moment is kind of curious because it's done in skaz, and then it's kind of taken over by the author, if I remember correctly. And then the author says, and then as far as his predictions go, only God knows, something like this, right?
It's very
Only God
dense.
knows. Right. There's a moment in which there is a kind of seriousness to it that I detected at least. And as you say, right, the story kind of keeps modulating itself between seriousness and sarcasm and irony. And so I just became curious about the war and which war
Flagen is thinking about and wants to participate in. Maya Kucherska, our colleague, wrote a very interesting paper. It's not published yet, but she delivered it in some conferences. So she thinks that it's actually he's going to the war in Hiva. That he wants to, that Flagen is interested in this war. Maya and I, we kind of talk about that and disagree. I don't think that it's Hiva for many reasons. First and foremost, because it was not depicted in the press of that time as something that the entire nation has to participate. Yeah, small war kind of, and it would be easy for us to get this hand with backward people who don't know how to fight and all these things. But in the press, in the periodical press of that time, there were lots of concerns about the complication of the diplomatic relations with the West, actually. And I think that it's more about this, a kind of, Leskov conveys the anxiety and the preparations for a possible war.
And not the Balkan War.
Not the Balkan War yet. It's 1873. The Balkan War is a little bit later. But the conflicts with the West.
Over Poland or?
No, not over Poland at that time, but over Central Asia, maybe with England or some other. So it's I think that it's basically about the West, but it's hard to say.
Thank you.
Is there a French-speaking devil in that story?
No, it's not in.
Well, kind of the magnetist.
Oh, he's not devil.
Well, he is referred to as short, and he says, no, I'm not quite short, I'm something close to it short, right? There's this play. Do you know?
As I said in the beginning, Leskov engages with many topical issues of the day, and spiritism was one of them. And he wrote a lot about that. It's actually a satirical a version of spiritism. So this is the upper classes who are involved that, and this is how Flagen
response.
His response, yes.
I'm not sure how much time we have left on. What time is it?
15 minutes left.
If please, more questions. I actually have a question that's very broad. And you started the talk by talking about the figure of the Stranik and how Leskov was one of many writers who found it useful. And I never really thought about it before, how, for example, in American literature, the Stranik, anything you would call Stranik is not inflected in the same way. And it's not used in the same way to interrogate like national identity. I can't imagine French texts of the 19th century, highlighting like wanderers or whatever they are. So this is a very general question, but just what exactly is so useful about this figure of the Stranik?
We need to keep in mind that there was a sect of Stranniki.
Yeah.
There were lots of Stranniki, which was a very weird kind of domination of
Right.
sect, partially involved in the criminal activity.
So when people said Stranik, did they think of these sectarians?
Sometimes. In most cases, Stranniki are the people who are, it's a pilgrimage.
Yeah.
And it's a pilgrimage to one Christian shrine to another Christian. So, and because religion is such a part of national identity, especially for the peasants, or in terms of how the peasants are viewed, Strannik develops into a figure, into a symbolic figure.
Okay. Thank you.
And it's just the most famous writers who worked with this symbol. In the 60s and the 70s, there were much more works like that. And all of them are about Russianness.
Right.
But what is interesting is Leskov among the few who placed his Strannik into the non-Russian context. And that's why it's very interesting to study him, because he is among the few Russian writers who who explored the imperial colonies, which he himself, most of the places that are described here, he himself visited, including the inner court. So he had such an experience, and it is reflected in his works.
Thank you. Yeah, were you gonna say?
I feel like I should be quiet.
Yes, Mag.
I'm afraid this is also a very broad question, but I'm interested in the relationship between a sort of a nationalist critique of empire and a more a broader anti-imperial position. Because I mean, in this nationalist critique, of course, there's two ways you can go, which you have alluded to a bit, right? You can say Russians are under sort of not gaining the benefits of this empire, so it needs to be harsher against everyone else. It needs to oppress everyone else to lift the Russians up, be more hierarchical. It doesn't sound like that's the way that Leskov goes. So could you talk a little bit about the relationship between those two and sort of how he gets from one to the other?
Good question. Thank you very much. I would say in the beginning of his career, especially during the Polish uprising, he was very much on the side of kind of nationalist discourse with the strong imperial connotations. We need to suppress them. We are the great nation, we have to suppress them. And it's not the best side of Leskov that I like. But actually, during the next 10 years, his works became still, he criticized the empire from the national standpoint, but this critique is increasingly sharp. And then in the late 1870s, he writes the story Na kraju sveta. And in this story, it's actually a powerful, very sharp critique of Russian missionaries that are part of the imperial structure, of the imperial institutions. And this story, even though there are some racist poems made about racist episodes about the native peoples of Siberia, Leskov begins to speak from their perspective. And it's by the end of the 70s, he begins to gravitate towards Tolstoy the anarchist. And since then, the state, the empire, is increasingly interrogated by him and criticized. So this is the major trajectory from the person who during the Polish uprising is very harsh And definitely on the side of the Russian Empire, he moved into a different direction.
If I can be so greedy, how do you explain that trajectory? I mean, do you see this as the result of some personal experience that he was having, or is it the result of readings he was doing? Was he influenced in his thinking by some other figures or by events that he saw? Or, I mean, how do we understand this sharpening critique?
I would say two factors were very important. One factor was Tolstoy, and Leskov increasingly gravitated towards Tolstoy, even though Leskov never lost an opportunity to criticize Tolstoy for some like non-violence, no resistance to violence. That's what was, but it was problematic for Leskov, but in general, he considered himself a follower of Tolstoy. The second one was a religious thing. Leskov, Leskov was a very religious person throughout his life, with increased engagement with religion, but not the religion of the official church, with an increased criticism of the official church. And he was trying to do pretty much what Tolstoy was doing. No nations, no differences between people. We are just the same. So this kind of the Christian attitudes contributed a lot to that. Also the wars that he and his contemporaries watched. Central Asian War, the war on Central Asia. Actually, its significance for Russian literary, national, intellectual discourse is not fully appreciated. It's enough to recall how Vasily Vereshchagin about his trajectory. He began as a person who celebrated the achievements of the Russian army in Central Asia and ended up with the painting The Wounded that made Alexander II relatively angry, and Alexander II refused to buy that painting that was commissioned, maybe not commissioned, but it was conceded by the royal house, by the Tsar, to buy that, and he decided, when he saw that, he refused to buy. So it's a kind of typical development. So they saw more and more wars. The war in Central Asia that was very bloody, and it is usually presented as a series of small wars or something that the Russian public wasn't interested in. It's not accurate from my point of view. Second, the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78, which Russia lost a lot of people there. And actually the result was very disappointing for Russian society, and it also gave an impetus to more critical vision of the empire.
Thank you.
Let's thank Professor Maiorova again.
Thank you for stimulating and very interesting.